Thanks everyone for coming out this Saturday afternoon. It's late, it's usually afternoon nana nap time, so hopefully I won't put you all to sleep. But I do want to agree with Ari, Queensland is out of control, way out of control. We're known as the deep north, just like Texas, the deep south. And just on one point, talking about the massive incarceration of people in the US, 1 in 28 children have a parent in prison there. And we actually don't know what the numbers are here, other than it's tens of thousands of children that get affected by their parents' imprisonment. And in the US, it's that bad in relation to so many children having a parent in prison that they even have a Muppet now in Sesame Street called Alex that has a father in prison. And he teaches children, or Sesame Street now teach children in their programs about bedtime, bath time and jail time. So it seems to be a very scary time. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge and thank the traditional custodians of the land that we know now as Bendigo, and as a non-Aboriginal woman who resides on Nullanpool land, which is south of Brisbane, that runs from a suburb called Cannon Hill in Whitefellas language through to Cleveland and over to Stradbroke Island. I have the privilege and responsibility of walking with many Aboriginal women, girls, men and boys, and I consider it my duty to name the negative impact of colonisation on all of us. And for we see the consequences in the very stark and profound ways when we enter our prisons and see firsthand the overrepresentation of Aboriginal women, men, boys and girls. Aboriginal women alone make up more than a third, about 34% of women prisoners across Australia. And in some prisons, depending on what jurisdiction, can make up 50, 70, 80, sometimes 95% in some individual prisons and youth detention centres or youth prisons. I'd like to acknowledge Heather, who's here today, my sister, that's been part of the struggle and has lived prison experience, and anyone else that has lived prison experience that is here in the audience today. It's important that those of us with experience speak out about that and unpack that for all of you to understand who we are. We don't have three heads. I'm a woman who's been in prison. We're women who have struggled in our lives, who've been criminalised in prison for many reasons, and we as a community need to understand that. We're not vicious monsters, like I said, with three heads. And for me, I can stand here and say I was an ex-prisoner, and here I can say I'm a lawyer. So try to get your head around that, because we actually don't fit into one box alone. We can fit into many boxes of who we are as identity. I'd like to acknowledge the organisers of the forum, and thank you for asking me to come and speak today. And of course, I want to acknowledge all the women languishing in prison across this country and around the world. And I suppose I want to explain what's has already happened this afternoon in many women's prisons across this country, and that's where women, mothers, and tomorrow's Mother's Day, may have had a visit with their children and family and friends, and the costs that women pay. In our jurisdiction, the way that they pay is by a so-called dignified strip search under the law, and what that means after they've had the privilege of cuddling and kissing their children in a prison system, they then have to go into a separate area and be strip searched for a dignified strip search. And what that actually means is you take the top half of your clothes off, including your bra, open your mouth, flick your ears, raise your boobs, turn around, then they'll give you your bra back, then you'll hand the bottom half of your clothes over, and in some times you will be asked by prison officers if you're menstruating to hand over your pad or tampon. And women still today talk about being asked to squat in regards to when they're strip searched. We call this nothing more than sexual assault by the state, and it's a regime that has to stop because it further traumatises women, particularly women who have been sexually abused, and we know that over 89% of women before they hit the prison gates have been sexually abused. So it's an ongoing trauma and ongoing abuse legalised by the state. I'm the woman I am because of other women, and we're here today to talk about justice, talking justice and our experiences of justice, no doubt. But who I am isn't just my experience. Where I've gotten in life isn't just my story. It's the experiences of thousands of women, and for many they feel that justice is for others, not for them. So many women have been let down by the justice system in this country and around the world. Martin introduced me as a prison abolitionist, and I actually want to explore that a bit because I hope that you too will join the movement of a prison abolitionist. Being a prison abolitionist is being part of a movement that seeks to reduce or eliminate prisons and the prison system and replace them with more humane and effective systems. It is distinct from prison reform, which is an attempt to improve conditions inside prisons. However, relying on prisons less can significantly improve their conditions by eliminating overcrowding. This doesn't mean I refuse to endorse reforms. There's important campaigns, for example, solitary confinement for bikies or associates under the Vlad law and the criminal code in Queensland, and one that I just talked about a minute ago, and that's sexual assault by the state being strip searching. A reform absolutely necessary. The difference resides in whether the reforms assist to make life more habitable for people in prison or whether they further entrench the prison industrial complex. So it's not an either-or situation. Imprisonment is morally reprehensible and indefensible and must be abolished. In an enlightened free society, prison cannot endure or it will prevail. Abolition is a long-term goal and ideal. The eradication of any oppressive system is not an easy task, but it is realisable, like the abolition of slavery or any liberation. So as long as there is the will to engage in the struggle, I hope you will join that struggle with me and many others around the world. The message of abolition requires honest language and new definitions, language related to power. We do not permit those in power to control our vocabulary, using system language to call prisoners inmates or punishment treatment, denies prisoners the reality of our experiences and makes us captors of the old system. Our own language and definitions empower us to define the prison realistically. Abolitionists believe reconciliation, not punishment, is a proper response to criminal acts. The present criminal injustice system focuses on someone to punish, caring little about the criminal's needs or the offender's needs or the victim's loss. The abolitionist response seeks to restore both the criminal and the victim to full humanity, to lives of integrity and dignity in the community. Abolitionists advocate the least amount of coercion and intervention in an individual's life and the maximum amount of care and services to all people in our community and society. Abolitionists work with prisoners but always remain non-members of the established prison system. Abolitionists learn how to walk the narrow line between relating to prisoners inside the system and remaining independent and outside that system. We resist the compelling psychological pressures to be accepted by people in the prison system. We are willing to risk pressing for changes that are beneficial to and desired by prisoners. In relating to those in power, we differentiate between the personhood of system managers, which we respect, and their role in perpetrating an oppressive system. Abolitionists are allies of prisoners rather than traditional helpers. We have forged a new definition of what is truly helpful to be caged, keeping in mind both the prisoner's perspective and the requirements of abolition, new insights into old cultural-laden views of the helping relationship, strengthen our roles as allies of prisoners. Abolitionists realise that the empowerment of prisoners and ex-prisoners is crucial to the prison system change. Most people have the potential to determine their own needs in terms of survival, resources and programs, and we support self-determination of prisoners and programs which place more power in the hands of those directly affected by the prison experience. Abolitionists view power as available to each of us for challenging and abolishing the prison system. We believe that citizens are the source of institutional power. By giving support to or withholding support from specific policies and practices, patterns of power can be altered. Abolitionists believe that crime is mainly a consequence of the structure of society. We devote ourselves to a community change approach. We would drastically limit the role of the criminal injustice systems. We advocate public solutions to public problems, greater resources and services for all people. Abolitionists believe that it is only in a caring community that corporate and individual redemption can take place. We view the dominant culture as more in need of correction than the prisoner. In caring communities have yet to be built. We believe in decriminalisation and decarceration. So why decriminalise? And we heard Nick Chowdhury this morning talking clearly about the decriminalisation of drug offences. Abolitionists advocate drastically limiting the role of criminal law. We do this not because we wish to encourage certain behaviour, but because we realise that criminal sanctions are not an effective way of dealing with social problems. There are far too many laws on the books, and it would be prohibitively expensive to enforce them all. This results in unjust and arbitrary law enforcement. Powerless persons are imprisoned while more powerful persons go free. Women, Aboriginal people, people who are poor, Homeless people, people with mental health issues, bear the brunt of an unequal law enforcement. The crimes most frequently considered for decriminalisation are those which are victimless offences that do not result in anyone's feelings that he or she has been injured, so as to impel him or her to bring the offence to the attention of the authorities. Behaviour not injurious to others, but made criminal by statutes based on moral standards which disapprove of certain forms of behaviour while ignoring others that are comparable. A system bursting at its seams is perhaps the most visible effect of overcriminalisation. Overcriminalisation encourages the wide use of discretionary power in law enforcement. Because there is no complainant, police resort to questionable means of enforcement. Investigative techniques used to gather evidence are often immoral and sometimes illegal. These include entrapment, which is lawful in Queensland, use of informers, wiretapping and use of constitutional rights such as illegal search and seizure, which we see used predominantly across the US, invasion of the right of privacy and self-incrimination. Decarceration refers to reducing the numbers of people going to and returning to prison. This means investing in both communities and individuals to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing, healthcare, education, employment and support. Decarceration strategies also require government policy and legislative change, including an end to prison expansion and ensuring alternative sentencing options like community-based orders and maintaining suspended sentence, which we've seen abolished here in this jurisdiction. Community organisations have a vital role to play in building the movement for decarceration and advocating for progressive social change. Sisters Inside is an abolitionist organisation. We are part of this movement for decarceration and advocating for progressive social change. So who is Sisters Inside? Established in 1992 when I was released in prison, Sisters Inside exists to advocate for the human rights of women in the criminal justice system and to address gaps and services available to these women. We work alongside criminalised and prison women to determine the best way to fulfil these roles. Sisters Inside provides services to women and girls that go through the court system, women who are in prison and girls who are in prison, youth prison, and of course following their release into the community. We also work with young women in the juvenile justice system and the children of criminalised and imprisoned women. Sisters Inside has progressively developed a unique model of service and highly successful programs which are informed by the wisdom of criminalised and imprisoned women and girls themselves. Wherever possible, Sisters Inside employs staff with lived prison experience, including a focus on employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island women and being guided by Aboriginal elders in our community. We provide services to marginalised, victimised, criminalised, racialised and institutionalised women and girls, especially those who are imprisoned. We also undertake policy and law reform initiatives, most of which these days are aimed at trying to undergo the outrageous injustices being perpetrated at breakneck pace in Queensland and across most jurisdictions in this country. We also make every effort to address the interconnectedness of economic, social, legal and political decisions that contribute to women and girls being the fastest growing prison population, not just in this country but in the Western world. As we see the further erosion of the Australians' international reputation as a human rights defender of women and girls, children, especially those most vulnerable because of multiple intersections of marginalisation and discrimination, be it race, gender, sexual orientations, ability, particularly debilitating mental health issues or those escaping violence, we are witnessing the exponential growth of women and girls in prison. As I said, women and girls are the fastest growing prison population worldwide. The fact that women and girls are the fastest growing prison population is not accidental. In Australia, we recognise that our links to the US and Canada, as Ari was speaking about before with the US, have meant that we were amongst the first countries to be impacted by the regressive so-called law and order agenda or the war on drugs agenda, which are making prisons the default option for those most significantly impacted by the destruction of social safety nets and the evisceration of medical, economic and educational standards and services. And I'm sure we'll see more cuts and the evisceration of more services under this Abbott regime next week when the budget's handed down. In too many communities and contexts, prisons are the only service that cannot turn away because of waiting lists, a lack of beds or resources, change in mandate, etc. Imagine if, instead of continuing to cram more people into overcrowded prisons, we limit the number of bed days available for judicial officers to impose as sentences, or if we turned women and girls away and would not allow them access to prisons when they really need housing, a shelter to escape from violence, some type of support services, whatever it may be, of their choice to deal with past sexual abuse, rapes and other forms of trauma, drug and or alcohol detoxification and treatment to address mental health and or alcohol and other addictions. In our organisation, we have recognised very early on that this reality very concretely by the change of our mission to articulate that we work with women who are criminalised versus the historic orientation of working with women who come into the conflict with the law. With this reality, we recognise that it is the law and policies that are increasingly coming into conflict with people's lives, resulting in the virtual inevitability of criminalisation rather than the notion that people are the full and consenting authors of their own circumstances. We are now rushing to follow the US and Canada's race to incarcerate the most dispossessed for longer and more brutalising periods. Ironically, this is occurring at a time when many US jurisdictions are retreating from regressive law and order agendas. Moreover, a panel of federal judges ordered more recently in California to reduce its prison population by 40,000 within a 2-year period, which reflects roughly a 27% cut from the current prison population of 150,000 people. Until very recently, Canadian politicians were ignoring their social and fiduciary responsibilities to Canadians by passing laws seemingly without concern as to the human and fiscal costs associated with them. The long list of new criminal justice reforms raised incarceration rates and sucked resources out of the community. As I speak today, the Queensland Government has refused to reveal the cost of our current crime agenda. It has been exposed, for example, for young people, that the boot camp, which has been enacted in the youth justice legislation, is costing us over $2 million per year. And the first 2 children that were actually placed in the boot camp ran away from that boot camp. And now, this year, within the 4 months of this year, there's only 4 young people in that boot camp, which is costing us $2 million. However, we had a bill introduced into Parliament last Thursday night that now will allow NGOs who are funded to run boot camps to be able to physically restrain young people in those boot camps, which we see as assault being legalised by the state on young people. However, they repealed youth justice conferencing that was highly successful. And I can tell you and all my colleagues, we know that not one young person ran away from youth justice conferencing. By creating criminally low social assistance, known as welfare or Centrelink or New Start or single parenting payment rates throughout Australia, ensure that many more poor people are immediately relegated to the criminalised underclass. Rather than resulting in the criminalisation of poor women for welfare fraud, prostitution, drug trafficking or whatever other survival strategies are employed, if we were truly interested in addressing fraudulent transactions that harm others, then criminally low welfare rates might result in the criminalisation of those who craft, those who pass and those who enforce the laws and policies, not those subjected to them. We're also seeing the increased feminisation and criminalisation of poverty. Welfare fraud is one of those of how poor women are increasingly likely to be criminalised. And for most women, it's an issue of need, not greed. Their attempts to survive poverty too often results in charges ranging from fraud, soliciting, pimping, living off the avails, importing and trafficking drugs, for example. As we learned via the Hamilton and Brown cases in Canada, African-Canadian single mothers are literally recruited to traffic narcotics as they exit meetings with their assistant workers. Women who are trying to make the rent and or feed their children, families, are especially vulnerable. It used to be that we might see women resorting to such means to address extraordinary expenses such as birthdays, Christmases and or other holidays, childcare, school camp expenses or even Mother's Day for tomorrow. However, it's increasingly the manner in which sole support mums are attempting to cover basic living costs such as bread, milk and even public transport costs. During the 1990s in Canada, all of the provincial, territorial and federal heads of corrections met and agreed that we needed to reduce reliance on prisons. They opined that as many as 75% of those in prison, either serving sentences or awaiting trial, could be released to the community without any corresponding issue in risk to public safety. The correctional investigator has repeatedly called on that government to address the needs of those with mental health issues in the community rather than continuing to abandon them in prisons. And more recently, we just saw the coroner inquest finalise of Ashley Smith, who died in a maximum security women's federal prison after hanging herself. And it was deemed by the inquest jury that it was manslaughter. 5 prison officers stood outside and watched her hang herself while they're on the phone to the powers above and were told not to intervene in her hanging until she turned blue. And there's a lot of information that you can go and read, and the decision of the coroner's court. And Canada, the federal government is now starting to talk about how they can set up other types of institutions for women with mental health issues. But we would once again argue that those issues need to be dealt with in the community and not within a closed prison environment. In the UK, noted policy leaders such as Pat Carline and the Howard League are amongst those calling for the criminal justice system to refuse to proceed with criminalising the young, those escaping violence, those with intellectual disabilities and mental health issues. They are also amongst those calling for more decarceration, community development and social reinvestment. Indeed, many academics, professionals and practitioners on the front lines have also characterised the push to criminalise the most depossessed as the present manifestation of race, ability, class and gender bias, and argue that this demands we examine our fundamental beliefs and notions of those interests and biased are privileged and at whose expense. When we know the histories of abuse, poverty and extreme marginalisation that is the reality of most women and girls with whom we work, it seems quite ludicrous that we continue to pretend that telling women and girls not to take drugs and dull the pain of abuse, hunger and other devastation, or to tell them they must stop the behaviour that allowed them to survive poverty, abuse, disabling health, especially mental health issues and others, in the face of no current or future prospect of any income, housing, medical, educational or other supports. Surely none of us thinks it of a benefit to anyone to continue to imprison women and girls and then release them into the street with little more than psychosocial cognitive skills or drug abstinence programs, along with the implicit judgment that they are in control of and therefore responsible for their situations, including their own criminalisation. We all must rethink, resist and reject such notions. Aboriginal women and girls continue to suffer the shameful and devastating impact of colonisation, from missions to child seizure to juvenile and adult imprisonment. Aboriginal women and girls are vastly overrepresented in prison type or institution types under state control. Although Aboriginal women make up less than 2% of the Australian population, they make up over 34% of the prison population in this country. And as I said before, in some parts of the country, over 85%. If you go to Townsville Women's Prison in north of Queensland, there's over 85% of Aboriginal women in that prison and over 90% can't read and write. And we're in 2014. Whose failure is that? And most of the Aboriginal women are classified as maximum security prisoners, because that's all we build these days is maximum security prisons. I do want to acknowledge Marlene, who's here today, and when she was the Commissioner of Queensland Corrections, that the Numbamba farm for women in Queensland was reducing and going to be closed by the previous Minister and DG of Corrections. However, when Marlene took over, she actually expanded the actual farm, and that's been better for women to be in that farm environment. So thanks for that, Marlene. But as a woman in power in Queensland, the misogynist boys cut loose on her, and she's back in Victoria. So Marlene might be someone good to talk to assist in this area in discussions. So she's up the back there if you want to put your hand up, Marlene. That's all right. We had our blues too, but that's okay. There goes your next job, yeah. Even as we work to deinstitutionalise and decarcerate, we are seeing that treatment is increasingly the colonial control mechanism of choice. In the last decade, the Aboriginal women's prison population has increased by 58.6%, where for non-Indigenous men, can anyone guess the increase of their incarceration in this country? You think about Aboriginal women, they make a very small percentage in this country, where there's more non-Indigenous men in this country. How much do you think the increase has been in that decade? More? 2,000%, so something more. Does anyone think less? Okay, it's been 58.6% for Aboriginal women, it's been 3.6% for men. And in our jurisdiction alone, since 2008, Aboriginal women have increased in the prison population by 41%, and it's been a decrease of non-Aboriginal men of 2.6%. So, you know, when we talk about, and when government tells us and policy makers tell us that our structures are not racist or based, you know, on the attack of gender, we know that they are definitely racist and definitely targeting women, absolutely. It's no accident who's criminalised, nor who is imprisoned, and nor is it an accident who is not. What if, instead of denying and defending abuse of power enforced by police and prison personnel, as well as the neglect and abuse of institutionalised persons, we collectively condemned and stopped such practices? Article 37 and 40 of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, or CROC, promise that children should not experience the cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, not to mention torturous treatment. We see children criminalised while being held by the state under care in residential care accommodation services, not just in our jurisdiction but in many jurisdictions in this country. We see, for example, 11-year-old children. 2 minutes? Oh shit, okay, I'm only halfway there. We see, I thought I had to speak for 45 minutes. That's right. We see that, for example, 11-year-old children in our state being criminalised daily because of behaviour in these residential care facilities. And we've seen a 13-year-old just 2 years ago killed after she tried to go to see her mother in court in the morning. She was in residential care. The carers said they would take her, they then refused to take her, so she stole the car keys, took the car, and they've called the police without telling the police that she's 13, young 13 Aboriginal kid with mental illnesses who was in care, under state care. They rang and said that she had assaulted workers, that there was someone in care that assaulted workers and stole the car. Police then saw the stolen car when they were driving to the residential care address, turned their lights off on young Paddy, planted it because she panicked, being a 13-year-old child, because she knew that the police were chucked a Yui to chase her. The police then realised when it came up on their screen, Paddy's history, being a young Aboriginal girl in care with mental health issues, so they turned the lights off and stopped. However, it was too late. She'd hit the accelerator, hit the curb on the road, cars flipped and was killed instantly. And I really can't talk about that matter anymore because we have standing in the Coroner's Court to appear in 2 weeks' time in Queensland. Sisters Inside does, due to public interest, to raise the systemic issues for children in residential care. And there's now a gagging order that's in place, that was put in place by the coroner at the request of the Department of Communities. But you can go back to Late Line 2 years ago and just search Patricia Gray, Gray, and the story is there about the tragedy that occurred in her life. Not only being a long-term order under child protection, but over 60 organisations were engaged to intervene in her life. However, it was an absolute fundamental failure, and she is now dead. Okay, I've got 2 minutes to talk. I suppose what I'll do to finish, because I did have a, I've got a visual. Okay, but that might take a few minutes and for questions. So what I'll do is finish on Leela Watson, an Aboriginal elder from Brisbane, word, and what she stressed for many years, and I think it's very relevant to us all. And she said, if you've come here to help me, then you're wasting your time. If you've come here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. So I just want to dedicate these words, and I can give my paper to the organisers for you all so you can continue to think about what I'm saying. I do want to dedicate the words and this visual experience that I'm going to present now to the memory of all women and girls who've died under the so-called protection of prison authorities, mental health authorities and child protection authorities, and of course refugees in our detention centres. And thank you all for the part that you do now and will do, and hopefully become part of the prison abolitionist movement in this world, to change this world and try to prevent harm befalling others. And to the women and girls with the lived experience who are my constant allies, agitators, mentors and friends, your strength, courage and perseverance continue to inspire me and drive me.